Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of precision.
Right, like it's engineering or something.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film.
And they just say, well, there it is. That is the problem.
Yeah, we apply a cast, we wait 6 weeks, and the problem is neatly solved.
It is a really comforting framework, honestly. We are culturally conditioned to expect our crises to be binary. Definitively broken or definitively healthy.
We genuinely do. We like things to be visible.
And more importantly, we expect the treatment to be a straight line.
Right, but then you step into the world of macroeconomics, and suddenly that simplistic x-ray machine is entirely useless.
Oh, absolutely useless.
You look at the diagnostic landscape of a nation, and it is just incredibly murky. Which brings us to a really striking paradox at the absolute heart of the American economy today.
The dual paradox.
Yes, the dual paradox. If we put the U.S. economy through an MRI, we are looking at a patient that is, on one hand, demonstrating unprecedented, almost unbelievable muscular strength. I mean, the wealth accumulation is staggering.
But simultaneously, there is this quiet, totally irreversible structural crisis creeping right into the bone marrow.
Exactly. We are getting richer,
Yeah.
and we are structurally deteriorating at the exact same time. It's wild to see on paper.
And to truly understand how those two contradictory realities coexist, we really have to look past the daily headlines.
Because the news is just exhausting, honestly.
Right. The daily news cycle is essentially just noise. It is the patient complaining about a headache.
Yeah.
To understand the actual trajectory of the organism, we have to look at the multi-decade trend lines. Those are the tectonic plates that truly dictate the future.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We have a massive, comprehensive data set compiled specifically for you, our listener, pulled directly from the World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. Census Bureau.
It's a fantastic compilation.
It really is. We are looking at 60 continuous years of macroeconomic indicators structured almost like a 15-page academic presentation.
And we're going to walk you through it.
Yeah, and for you listening right now, whether you are trying to plan a career transition or figuring out the long-term horizon for your investment portfolio, or just trying to understand the forces reshaping your neighborhood.
This data reveals the hidden threads.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to use a four-dimensional logic framework today.
Right, covering the innovation engine, structural reshaping, the social pain points, and finally, environmental breakthroughs.
Let's look at the sheer scale of the wealth generation first. Because if we're going to talk about a structural crisis, we first have to respect the size of the engine.
We really do.
When we look at gross national income, or GNI, per capita, and this is measured in constant 2015 U.S. dollars to strip out inflation, the leap is profound.
It's basically a vertical line on the chart.
Yeah, in 1960, we are looking at roughly $25,000. By recent years, that number has skyrocketed to over $66,000.
That isn't just growth. That is a fundamental re-rating of what the average citizen's economic output actually represents.
And if we zoom out to the macroeconomic level, GDP has grown astronomically from around $1 trillion in the mid-20th century
to steadily crossing the $20 trillion mark.
20 trillion. It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It is, but I think the most crucial metric in your sources isn't just raw GDP. It is the gross domestic savings and the adjusted net national income.
I want to pause there because I think a lot of people hear GDP on the news every single day, but GNI and adjusted net national income are very different mechanisms for measuring success.
They absolutely are. GDP is basically just drawing a chalk circle around the geographic borders of the United States and counting everything produced inside of it.
Right.
But in a hyper-globalized economy, GDP loses some of its narrative power. GNI, gross national income, shifts the focus from geography to ownership.
Ah, I see. So it factors in international income flows.
Exactly. So if an American technology company designs a smartphone in California, manufactures it in Asia, and sells it in Europe,
the GDP might get credited elsewhere.
Right, but GNI accounts for the massive wealth that flows back to the American parent company. And theoretically, it's shareholders and employees.
It gives you a much more accurate picture of the wealth actually commanded by the residents of the country.
Precisely. And then the adjusted net part of the national income takes it a step further. It forces us to pay our bills, so to speak.
Right, it subtracts the depreciation of physical capital.
Yes. It accounts for the wear and tear on our machinery, the degradation of our bridges, the aging of our server farms. So when the data shows that income exploding upward, it means that even after we pay the massive toll of maintaining our physical world, the true net wealth accumulation is compounding.
It makes me think of compounding interest, but applied to the structural capacity of a whole nation.
That is a great way to look at it.
It doesn't just grow linearly. It takes the previous decade's technological success, bakes it into the foundation, and uses it as the new floor. Gross domestic savings hovered between 17 and 23% throughout this.
Which is a massive pool of capital.
But here is what I find difficult to reconcile when I look at this 60-year timeline. I mean, we lived through the early 1980s recession. We saw the dot-com bubble burst, wipe out trillions.
We lived through the 2008 global financial crisis.
Exactly, which fundamentally broke the banking system.
Yeah.
And we just went through a global pandemic. Yet the area under the curve just keeps expanding.
It always bounces back to a higher baseline.
What is actually fueling this machine so it doesn't run out of gas after 60 years of crises?
That resilience is the core mystery here, and it forces us to ask what the actual fuel is. Because wealth, in the form of a high GNI, is the result. It is not the catalyst.
Okay, so what is the catalyst?
If we want to understand how the U.S. economy continually absorbs these massive shocks, we have to look at the transition of capital itself, the shift from physical assets to intangible assets.
Which brings us to the data on research and development. And this is where the scale of the transition becomes really visible.
The R&D numbers are staggering.
They really are. The percentage of total GDP dedicated purely to R&D has climbed steadily over the decades, from around 2.45% to a massive 3.5%.
We really need to unpack that 3.5% figure, because breaking the 3% threshold for R&D spending is a massive psychological and structural marker in macroeconomic circles.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. When a country devotes over 3.5% of a $20 trillion GDP to research, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Money that is not building a physical bridge, not paving a road, and not manufacturing a tangible widget.
So that capital is being poured into abstract problem solving.
Exactly. It proves the economy has evolved past manufacturing goods. It is manufacturing the ideas that govern the goods.
And looking at the data to populate those labs, the number of researchers in R&D per million people expanded from roughly 3,100 to well over 4,300.
Which is a huge structural shift in the workforce.
Yeah, and non-resident patent applications broke the 330,000 mark. We are talking about proprietary software architectures, advanced algorithms, pharmaceutical therapeutics, the intangibles.
Yes. Historically, capital was heavy. It was a steel mill in Ohio. It was a fleet of diesel trucks. And physical capital has a hard mathematical limit.
Right. A steel mill can only produce a specific tonnage of steel per day.
And it constantly degrades, requiring massive reinvestment just to maintain the status quo. But when an economy aggressively shifts its capital into intangibles,
like software or a new vaccine?
exactly. When you spend $5 billion developing a new software operating system, the economic leverage changes entirely. Once that knowledge is created, the cost of replicating it and deploying it to a billion people globally is essentially zero.
So it has infinite leverage.
It really does. That is the permanent, high-leverage growth base that allows the economy to shrug off physical, cyclical downturns.
I see the logic, but I have to challenge the premise here a bit. I mean, simply throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at research doesn't automatically guarantee this compounding wealth.
That is a fair critique.
You can hire all the researchers you want, but if the broader society isn't structurally capable of utilizing those ideas, the investment is just dead capital. You can invent the world's greatest software, but if your population doesn't have computers, it doesn't matter.
That is an incredibly important distinction, and the data actually validates your skepticism. The ideas wouldn't stick if the infrastructure didn't simultaneously evolve to absorb them.
Right.
And that is where we look at the data on the digital divide, or rather the bridging of it.
The S-curve in the data set.
Yes. The data set tracks the percentage of individuals using the internet. In the early 1990s, it is a flat line near zero, specifically around 0.7%.
I remember those days. Dial-up noises and all.
We all do. But then we see this violent S-curve of adoption, where it explodes upward, breaking 50%, 70%, and stabilizing today above 93%.
So that steep middle section of the curve, the 20 to 70% jump, wasn't just people buying modems.
No, it was a decade where a massive digital dividend was released into the economy. That 93% penetration rate is the nervous system that allowed the intangible assets to be instantly monetized.
It is like the R&D spending created an entirely new, highly advanced brain for the economy. But a new brain requires a fundamentally different kind of body to operate.
That is a great analogy.
If your brain is suddenly capable of complex algorithmic problem solving, but your body is still only built for lifting heavy rocks in a quarry, you have a mismatch.
A severe one.
And looking at the structural remaking of the U.S. economy in this data set, the body of the economy underwent a brutal, totally irreversible mutation to serve that new brain.
Mutation is an apt word for it. When you inject 3.5% of your GDP into advanced R&D, you simply cannot expect your society to keep churning out agricultural goods and basic textiles the way it did in 1950.
The physical architecture of the workforce had to change.
It had to.
And the 100% stacked area charts in the data tell that story perfectly. The employment in agriculture dropped to around 1%. It is virtually non-existent as a mass employer today.
Right.
The industry sector, which includes traditional manufacturing and mining, contracted heavily, falling from over 24% down to roughly 19%.
While the service sector exploded.
Yeah, services expanded from 72% all the way up to over 79%.
We need to be extraordinarily precise about what those contracting percentages actually mean on the ground, because this is where economic data often clashes with political narratives.
You mean the hollowing out narrative?
Exactly. When agriculture and industry shrink as a percentage of employment or GDP, it does not mean they vanished. The absolute volume of food grown and goods manufactured in the U.S. actually increased over this period.
Oh, wow. So we're making more stuff with fewer people.
Precisely. The sectors became hyper-efficient because of the R&D investments, which gave us GPS-guided autonomous tractors, advanced drought-resistant seeds, robotics.
Automated supply chains.
Right, those physical sectors require a tiny fraction of the human labor they used to. They require a much smaller slice of the total economic pie to achieve massive output.
Okay, that makes sense. If I look around an auto manufacturing plant in the 1970s, there are thousands of humans turning wrenches. But if I look at an advanced EV manufacturing plant today, there are hundreds of humans programming massive robotic arms.
Exactly. The output of cars is higher, but the human capital required to make them plummeted.
And because an economy is a closed ecosystem, nature abhors a vacuum. When agriculture and basic manufacturing systematically required less human capital, the service sector rushed in to absorb that displaced labor.
Yes. And today, services is a very broad umbrella. It includes retail and hospitality, sure, but in a highly developed economy, it primarily refers to high-value cognitive labor.
Finance, software engineering, complex systems design, legal services, healthcare.
The workforce migrated out of the factory floor and into the office, the lab, and the server farm.
But let's look at the friction of that transition. It is easy for us to sit here and say, the workforce migrated, as if a 50-year-old assembly line worker in a declining manufacturing town simply took a weekend coding boot camp and became a software engineer in Silicon Valley.
Right, that isn't how it works at all.
That shift is generational. The displaced industrial worker likely suffered a permanent loss of earning power, while it was their children who went to university and entered the high-tech service economy.
It is a painful transition.
So, for you listening, when you hear that manufacturing shrunk, do you see that as a hollowing out of the industrial working class or an inevitable, necessary upgrade to reach that staggering wealth accumulation?
That tension is exactly why the X-ray is murky. From a purely macroeconomic efficiency standpoint, the data suggests this is an absolute necessity.
You can't reach a $66,000 per capita income by competing globally in basic manufacturing.
You really can't. You have to move up the value chain to intangibles.
No.
But your point about the generational friction is vital. A highly digital service-based economy is profoundly reliant on a specific type of human capital.
Right.
A factory can run with a few skilled mechanics, standardized raw materials, and a lot of electricity. A massive healthcare network or a global software firm requires legions of highly trained, specialized, continuously educated human beings.
And that reality brings us to the single most alarming data point in this entire 60-year data set.
The demographic shift?
Yes. Just as the American economic engine became entirely dependent on highly specialized human capital to maintain its growth, The underlying supply of that human capital began to fundamentally mathematically collapse.
What's fascinating here is how quietly this happens. It isn't a sudden crash. It is a slow-motion demographic landslide.
We are looking at a phenomenon often called the silver tsunami. If you were to visualize the demographic data in your sources, you would see two lines intersecting in a terrifying demographic cross. A golden cross of demographics, if you will.
Is that a very concerning one?
On one hand, the young age dependency ratio, which basically measures the proportion of kids and teenagers to the working age adults, plummeted drastically. It fell from over 52% down to 27.6%.
We simply stopped having as many children relative to the workforce.
But simultaneously, the old age dependency ratio spiked.
Yeah.
It shot up from 14.7% to roughly 27.6%. They literally crossed paths. The total population ages 65 and above nearly doubled its share of the country.
We are talking about tens of millions of people who are largely exiting the productive labor force and entering the dependent class.
I cannot emphasize enough how critical the age dependency ratio is as a macroeconomic vital sign. It is the raw physics of an economy.
It is a strict mathematical measure of the working age population versus the non-working age population.
The people actively producing goods, designing software, earning high wages, and paying the bulk of the income taxes, versus the young and the old who structurally require care, education, pensions, and massive medical resources.
For the entire second half of the 20th century, the U.S. enjoyed what economists call a demographic dividend.
A massive surplus of workers.
Yes, there is a huge bulge of working-age people relative to dependents. The societal carrying capacity was incredibly high, but the data makes it unequivocally clear that demographic dividend is over.
The mathematical advantage just evaporated.
It did.
If I think about it structurally, it is like the load-bearing walls of a massive skyscraper. For decades, we had thick, robust, load-bearing pillars, the working-age population, easily supporting the upper floors of the dependent population.
And now those pillars are thinning out.
While the upper floors are getting heavier and heavier, the structural integrity is under immense stress. But this is where the paradox hits me.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the workforce is shrinking relative to the number of retirees, how on earth did we just spend the first 20 minutes of this deep dive proving that the economy is compounding its wealth at an unprecedented rate?
It seems impossible, right?
It does. If the demographic pillars are shrinking, who is actually doing the work to keep the GNI rising?
That is the defining question of this entire analysis. An aging population inherently creates massive drag. It strains the labor market by reducing the absolute number of workers. It strains pension systems. And most acutely, it places a crushing burden on healthcare infrastructure.
Let's talk about the health data, because the sources highlight a distinct shift there.
Right, non-communicable diseases.
Exactly. Things like cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory issues.
Yeah.
They now account for the vast, overwhelming majority of deaths, pushing past 88%.
Because we cured or managed most of the infectious diseases that used to kill people young.
We are living long enough to develop complex, chronic conditions.
Precisely. But treating chronic non-communicable diseases in an elderly population is incredibly capital intensive. It requires constant monitoring, expensive pharmaceuticals, and long-term care facilities.
Which pushes total health expenditure up dramatically. The data shows it climbing past 16% of the total GDP.
That is a massive structural counterweight pulling down against the wealth generation. So to answer your question of how we survived this demographic squeeze and kept the economy growing.
Yeah, how did we?
The system had to aggressively, systematically pull every single available adult into the highly productive labor fold.
Ah, so if you don't have new workers entering through a high birth rate, you have to find a hidden reserve of labor already within your borders.
Exactly. When you lack a naturally growing base of young workers entering the bottom of the pyramid, you have absolutely no choice but to maximize the efficiency, the productivity, and the total economic participation of the adults you do have.
You cannot afford to leave half of your potential cognitive capacity on the sidelines.
You really can't.
And the data perfectly maps that aggressive expansion. Let's look at the metrics on gender dynamics and human capital, because this is where the math was saved.
The gender dividend.
Yes. If we look at the female labor force participation, we see a resilient, massive integration of women into the formal labor force over these decades. The ratio of female to male labor force participation climbs significantly, up from around 74.5% to over 83.9%.
But it wasn't just raw labor. It was highly educated cognitive labor.
Right, the educational attainment metrics show that the proportion of women completing a bachelor's degree or higher marched forcefully upward. The percentage of women with at least a bachelor's degree went from under 20% to over 37.6%.
This is the critical mechanism. We established that the demographic dividend of a booming youth population ended. The gender dividend is the exact mechanism the U.S. economy used to hedge against the aging crisis.
So by heavily investing in the higher education of women and pulling them into the high-value service, healthcare, and tech sectors, the economy unlocked a massive, previously underutilized reservoir of human capital.
Highly educated women entering the workforce in droves provided the crucial intellectual firepower needed to sustain that 3.5% R&D spending.
They became the new cognitive load-bearing walls.
Exactly, to keep the GNI compounding.
It is a fascinating structural shift. The transition from an economy based on physical brawn, like mining and heavy manufacturing, to an economy based on cognitive skill, fundamentally changed the qualifications for high-paying work.
It removed the physical barriers to entry and created a massive vacuum for educated talent.
Which women rapidly filled. And alongside that labor integration, we see a global integration as well.
Right, the trade and FDI data.
Yeah, the data shows that net foreign direct investment inflows had these huge volatile spikes, sometimes breaking past 3.4% of the GDP.
Which is global capital chasing that exact innovation ecosystem we've been talking about.
And exports of goods and services hovered constantly in the 10 to 13% range. So we pulled every domestic worker we could into the system, and we pulled massive amounts of global capital in too.
It was a total mobilization.
But let me challenge the narrative of this total inclusion, because I think there is a darker underlying reality here.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
We've pulled everyone into the system, and we've maximized the educational output of our workforce to sustain the engine. But does this level of inclusion mean everyone is actually winning? Or does it just mean that everyone is required to play the game to survive?
It's a very fair question.
Because when I look at the Gini index data in your sources, which measures wealth and income inequality, it stubbornly hovers in the high 30s to low 41s. It hasn't improved.
It really hasn't.
The dumbbell plot in the presentation outline shows this huge gap. The top 20% of earners are capturing a massive, disproportionate share of the income, hovering over 46.5%. while the bottom 20% is fighting over roughly 5%.
The Matthew effect. The rich get richer.
Exactly. Everyone might be integrated into the economy, but the rewards of this system are wildly skewed. Top-level harvesting while the bottom stagnates.
You've hit on the fundamental friction of the intangible economy. A high-tech, knowledge-based economy generates massive wealth, but the mechanics of that wealth generation inherently disproportionately reward those who own the intangible assets.
The patents, the equity, the algorithm.
Yes, it creates a winner-take-all dynamic. If you write a brilliant piece of code, it can replace the labor of 1,000 middle management workers.
And the coder captures all that value.
The coder and the equity owners of the software company capture the massive value of that efficiency, while the middle managers face stagnant wages or displacement.
So yes, everyone is integrated into the system, but the relative distance between the floor and the ceiling has stretched dramatically.
It is a societal folding.
The top pulls away, compounding its wealth through high-leverage assets, while the middle and bottom face the stagnant reality of paying for the rising costs of housing and healthcare.
Exactly. The economy is breathtakingly efficient at generating total wealth, but the structural mechanism of that generation is not inherently equitable. The gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20% is the social friction that this economic engine is constantly generating.
However, despite this severe inequality and the crushing demographic weight of the silver tsunami, we have to acknowledge that this highly efficient, modernized economy did manage to structurally solve one major historical problem.
And it is a profound victory that often gets completely buried under the anxiety of the daily news cycle.
Which leads us to a truly fascinating dimension of the data, the environmental breakthrough.
Yes, the decoupling.
When we look at the macro data, there is a clear, unequivocal decoupling of economic growth from environmental pollution. Let's look at the carbon data first. The carbon intensity, which is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per dollar of GDP, dropped from 0.9 all the way down to roughly 0.27.
In environmental economics, the term for this phenomenon is decoupling, and for a very long time, it was considered a theoretical holy grail that might be impossible to achieve.
Really? Impossible.
Well, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, there was an ironclad rule. If a country's wealth went up, its pollution went up in lockstep. To get richer, you fundamentally had to burn more coal, cut down more trees to build more factories, and spew more emissions into the sky.
But the U.S. macroeconomic data proves, at scale, that this historical rule can be broken.
It is hard to visualize how you grow wealth without growing a physical footprint, but it makes perfect sense when we tie it back to our earlier conversation about intangible assets.
Think about how we consume music. In the 1990s, generating $1 billion in music revenue required a massive physical supply chain. You had to cut down forests to make cardboard packaging, mine petroleum to manufacture millions of physical plastic CDs.
And fuel fleets of diesel trucks to ship those CDs to thousands of brick-and-mortar stores.
The physical and carbon footprint was massive. Today, generating $1 billion in music revenue is just streaming ones and zeros from a highly efficient server farm. The economic value totally decoupled from the physical footprint.
That is the perfect mechanism to explain decoupling. A transition to a high-tech, service-based economy severs the link between GDP and environmental degradation.
And we see it in the localized pollution data, too. The specific data on PM 2.5 exposure, the tiny, dangerous particles in the air, dropped from an annual average of 14.1 micrograms per cubic meter steadily down to around 7.5.
It is approaching the World Health Organization's highly strict guidance levels.
And the land use data shows the exact same stabilization. The amount of total land covered by forest remained an absolute, flat, unmoving 33.8 to 33.9% throughout the dataset.
A strict ecological red line was maintained even amidst massive urbanization.
But I want to connect the dots here, because I don't think this environmental cleanup was purely driven by altruism. Was the push for cleaner air just a cultural awakening, or was there an economic mandate forcing this shift?
That is where the entire narrative ties together. The push for clean air was absolutely an economic mandate, and it connects directly back to the silver tsunami.
The aging population.
Yes. Remember the demographic data? We have tens of millions of people aged 65 and older. Remember the health data? Over 88% of deaths are caused by non-communicable chronic diseases like cardiovascular and respiratory issues.
Oh, wow.
What happens if you have an aging population, highly susceptible to respiratory failure, breathing the heavily polluted air of the 1980s?
The healthcare system collapses.
Precisely. The medical bills alone would bankrupt the nation. You simply cannot afford to maintain an aging population in a highly polluted environment.
The drop in particulate matter damage isn't just a win for the environment. It is a micro indicator of macro quality of life that is fundamentally necessary to manage the economic burden of the silver tsunami.
The economy had to clean up the air to protect the fragile human capital that was suddenly demanding massive healthcare resources. The transition to services enabled the decoupling, but the demographic crisis made it an absolute necessity.
It is incredible how these threads pull on each other. I mean, the R&D spending creates the technological capacity. That tech forces a structural shift away from heavy industry into services.
Right.
The service economy demands highly educated cognitive labor, which pulls women into the workforce to replace the shrinking youth demographic. But that aging demographic develops chronic diseases, which forces the economy to leverage its new technological efficiency to clean up the air.
All to prevent a total collapse of the healthcare infrastructure.
It is a profoundly interconnected machine. Which brings us to a synthesis of this entire deep dive. If we were to plot the future of the American economy on a multidimensional radar chart, based purely on the structural reality of this data set, what does the shape of that future look like?
What's fascinating here is that if we plot those points, we see a shape stretched to its absolute limits by contradictory forces.
The dual paradox again.
Exactly. On one axis, we have high economic innovation. The R&D engine is roaring, creating immense intellectual capital. On another axis, we have high environmental efficiency. We are successfully decoupling wealth generation from carbon intensity and localized pollution.
So the U.S. has unequivocally won the game of absolute wealth creation and environmental efficiency.
Yes. However, stretching the chart violently in the opposite direction, we have severe aging pressure and persistent social inequality.
The greatest hidden threat isn't a lack of technological capability. It's the internal structural friction. The load-bearing walls are stressed.
Exactly. The burden of an aging society, combined with a highly unequal distribution of the immense wealth being generated, creates a fundamental tension that the economy will have to reconcile.
The shrinking working age base is going to have to support a massive elderly dependent class.
And they will have to do it while navigating a digital labor market where the rewards are heavily skewed toward the top 20% who own the intangible assets.
And as we look at this diagnostic X-ray, it is so important to realize that while data doesn't strictly dictate destiny, it absolutely defines the playing field.
It defines the boundaries of what is possible.
Yeah, the structural realities of this data set, the demographic shifts, the irreversible transition to a service and intangible economy, they are permanent.
We are not going back to an agrarian society.
The massive industrial factories of the 1950s are not coming back to employ millions of unskilled workers. And the demographic curve is not going to magically unage. The playing field is set.
We have to adapt our societal expectations, our educational systems, and our investments to this new architecture, rather than trying to rewind the clock to a physical economy that simply doesn't exist anymore.
And that is the ultimate takeaway from the data. The challenge for the next 60 years isn't figuring out how to grow the economic pie. The R&D engine has proven we know how to do that.
The existential challenge is figuring out how to distribute the weight of the pie so the structural table doesn't collapse under the demographic pressure.
What an incredible journey through the hidden mechanisms of our world. We've seen how technological innovation and a structural shift to a knowledge economy managed to solve the environmental constraint of economic growth, essentially breaking the centuries-old rule that wealth requires pollution.
It's a huge shift.
We found the hidden labor reserves necessary to keep the engine running through the gender dividend. But as you look at your own community, your own family, and your own workplace today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
A provocative one.
Can innovation solve the human constraint? When the ultimate structural crisis is simply that we are all getting older and the demographic dividend that built the 20th century is gone, will AI and advanced automation become our new artificial young workforce?
Will algorithms become the new load-bearing walls?
Or are we headed for an era where the battle between economic efficiency and the immense social burden of aging reshapes our society entirely? In the second half of this century, what matters more in this grand game, efficiency or equity?
That is the big question.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your custom sources. Keep looking past the headlines and keep questioning the data around you.